welcome back to another episode of the Congressional Western Podcast, a voice for rural America. I am Chairman Dan Newhouse. I want to thank you for being with us. Today, I am joined by two guests to talk about the urgent need to reform the Endangered Species Act, or as most commonly referred to as the ESA. First, we have one of our most distinguished members of the Congressional Western Caucus, representing the great state of Wyoming, the cowboy state, Congresswoman Harriet Hageman. Harriet, thank you so much for being with me on the program today.
Dan, I appreciate the invitation and I enjoy the Western Caucus, and you've done just an absolutely fabulous job as our leader. So thank you. I know it takes a lot of extra work, and it definitely shows that you care about these issues.
Well, I appreciate that, Harriet. You know, you're going to say nice things, they're going to have you back again. Great. Also joining me today is Mr. Rob Gordon. He's a policy expert on the ESA. His distinguished careers included serving at the United States Department of the Interior, the U.S. Geological Survey, and also the House Natural Resources Committee, among many other stops along the way in his professional life. So, Rob, thank you very much for taking time out of your busy day to be with us.
It's absolutely a pleasure to join you, and I'm very encouraged that you're dedicated to looking at the ESA and how it can be fixed, because it is in desperate need.
Well, that's exactly what we want to talk about today. So thanks, Rob, for being part of this conversation. So let me just start things out before we get into questions. In December of 2023, the Endangered Species Act, the ESA, turned 50. It's 50 years old. And I got to say, being as objective as possible, it's been kind of a disappointing 50 years. The purpose of the ESA is, just like its original founding documents say, to recover vulnerable species. Yet when you take a glance at its track record, that shows that the law has miserably failed at achieving that goal. In fact, get this, less than 3% of species listed under the ESA by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services have officially recovered. But even that low rate doesn't quite tell the entire story, as I'm hoping that we will find out more on today. Reforming the ESA to work better for both species and landowners is a priority of the Western Caucus. On that note, last year, the House Natural Resources Committee Chairman, Bruce Westerman, which we've had on our podcast before, he and I launched something called an ESA working group. And the purpose of that is to examine the law, address its failures, and come up with recommendations. And I'm very hopeful that we're going to have a lot more to say about that in very soon in coming months. We're very fortunate that Representative Hageman is one of our working group members. We've come to the conclusion, I think, that drastic changes are necessary to the ESA to ensure that it becomes more effective at recovering the vulnerable species without being weaponized by extreme environmental activists for the reasons of usurping the rights of private property owners. And we've seen that happen across the country. So let's get into some questions and dig into this, shall we? I want to first turn to Representative Hageman. So Harriet, across the West, each state and district have unique issues with the ESA, right? That's not a one-size-fits-all thing. In Wyoming, it's the listing of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem population of grizzly bears, which by all metrics has recovered. Could you talk a little bit about the grizzly bears recovery and how the ESA has failed communities in your state?
Yes, and I think that the grizzly bear is indicative of the failure of the Endangered Species Act, as you described just a moment ago. And that is that after 50 years, we still only have about 3% of the listed species as being identified as recovered.
Mhm.
And that's one of the misnomers, because it isn't that we haven't protected these species during the past 50 years. In fact, we have. But the question becomes whether the Fish and Wildlife Service will actually move forward with delisting. And so we have a metric by which we can say only 3% of the species have been delisted, but that doesn't mean that we haven't actually succeeded in recovering a lot of species, but it is to the advantage of the environmental groups and the Fish and Wildlife Service to keep those species listed for a whole host of reasons. And that's where the grizzly bear comes in. So the greater Yellowstone population of grizzly bears has been listed as a threatened but not endangered species since 1975. And its original recovery goal was 500 bears. Now, under the Endangered Species Act, whenever the Secretary of Interior lists a particular species, they also have to do a recovery plan. And that recovery plan sets forth, okay, the number of animals that is considered a recovered population. They need to identify the things that are the risks or the threats to a particular species. So if it is another predator within the ecosystem, or if there is a lack of water, or there is an invasive species, or whatever it may be, then this recovery plan will identify the various things that impact recovery of a species. We met the recovery goal for the greater Yellowstone ecosystem grizzly bear over 20 years ago. And today we have nearly 1,100 bears in this particular ecosystem. The Fish and Wildlife Service itself has indicated that the Yellowstone National Park is now saturated with grizzly bears. It's affecting other wildlife. They're moving outside of Yellowstone National Park. We're seeing other problems with it. But we've met and exceeded the recovery goals for over 20 years. They now pose the grizzly bears in Wyoming now pose a significant threat to both humans and animals, livestock, and again, other wildlife. The state of Wyoming has spent $59 million on recovery and has an excellent management plan in place to ensure that a recovered grizzly bear population would continue to be protected. That's something else that I don't think most people understand, is that it's not the Fish and Wildlife Service agents that are out there on the ground protecting these little animals and taking care of them and making sure that they're safe. It's generally your Game and Fish Department or your DNR, Department of Natural Resources, if that's what it's called. Those that are the entities that actually implement the recovery plan on the ground. So it's the state folks that are already managing most of these animals, most of these endangered or threatened species. And so turning it over to the states is again kind of a misnomer, because the states are already managing most of these wildlife. The question becomes whether they can do so pursuant to the state management plan. But the goal of the Endangered Species Act for the greater Yellowstone grizzly has clearly been met, and we should rightly return that management to the state. And we just simply cannot continue to allow activist courts or agency bureaucrats to block sound species management. But that's in fact what is happening. But I am extremely thankful for my colleagues on the Natural Resource Committee, of which I am a member, for their support for the delisting of the greater Yellowstone population of the grizzly bears. And I'm hoping that this bill can move forward on the floor before too long.
Great, Harriet. Thank you very much. Can I just say that this sounds like an unbearable situation for the people of Wyoming. Say, Rob, you recently authored something that was very interesting, an in-depth study of the ESA for the Western Caucus Foundation. We appreciate that. That study investigates the so-called success stories of recovered species. Could you talk about what you found when you researched the species that the Fish and Wildlife Service claims to have recovered under the ESA?
Absolutely. To begin with, what I should do is I kind of like to describe the ESA in very simple terms so that metric of recovery is more meaningful. And I think you touched upon this earlier. But basically, the Endangered Species Act is under the Endangered Species Act, the Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries Service are supposed to identify species that are endangered, plants and animals. And then they put them on the list. and then they fix them up. And when that process has been completed, the species is considered recovered. What I did is I looked at all of the species that have been removed from the list. And for comparative purposes, there's about 1,700 species listed today. But at the time I completed that study, more than half of the 62 species listed as being recovered were not really legitimate recoveries. It kind of pointed to what Representative Hageman stated, and that's that the ESA is not really working as a conservation tool, but it's become a land use control tool and a legal weapon. When I say the 62 species that are called recovered are not legitimate, what I mean is that most of them owed what was called recovery to the use of erroneous data when the species were first put on the list. That is, they were not endangered. They were never really endangered. And the degree to which the data was very poor is just striking. There's an example of a lizard on an island off the coast of Puerto Rico called the Manito gecko, where state agents, I think, originally went out and surveyed for it, and they found less than 20. And based on this, it was added to the endangered species list. And decades later, it was recognized, hey, we surveyed for this lizard during the day. It's actually nocturnal. And when they counted them, when they did nocturnal counts, they found it numbered in the thousands. There was a plant in California that was put on the list called Hoover's woolly star. After it was listed, there was a good rain and additional surveys conducted. And in just one of four, what they call metapopulations, over 100 million Hoover's woolly stars were identified.
Wow.
There's another plant called the running buffalo clover. And when it was put on the list decades and decades ago, they thought there were perhaps just 4 individual plants in one county. In 2021, it was taken off the list and revealed that there were now known to be 175 populations in 80 counties and in 6 states, and just one of them had more than 60,000 plants in it. None of these cases were the result of people going out on the ground, doing muddy boots conservation and recovering the species to have these numbers. The species had those numbers when they were put on the list. They never should have been there. So basically, these recoveries are in significant part a recognition that the scientific standards under the ESA have been very poor, and it's allowed people to use the law, including the agencies and other through litigation, to use the law for other than conservation, basically for land use control. And then removing the species as recoveries has been a long-standing practice. I'm not the only one to recognize this. The GAO recognized it in a report back in the 1980s with 1 or 2 of the original delistings. The Fish and Wildlife Service recognized it. In one case, even the National Wildlife Federation recognized it. So basically, the claims of success and recoveries are very deceptive. And this has not only applied to species delisted as recovered, but also species that are proposed for delisting as recovered, and species that have been lowered in their protection level from endangered to threatened status. So it's a serious scientific integrity problem, and reveals that this law is being used for other than what the public thinks. So there's a great deal of deception involved here.
Well, thanks, Rob. Well, one word I can think of to say is wow. Makes me think of a lot of questions about this, what I would call an enlightening study. I wonder how many other species are wrongly listed that of the 1,700 that are out there. That's truly amazing. I would encourage our listeners to read this report and to get more detail on what Rob has uncovered here. As I said earlier, Harriet, you're a member of our ESA working group, which we set up to examine problems within the ESA and hopefully find some workable solutions. One thing in particular we're investigating is how litigation drives decision-making around the ESA. So you've demonstrated your expertise in this area, someone who spent their career before coming to Congress practicing law very successfully, I might add, on a lot of resources issues. Could you talk a little bit from your perspective, how the law has been and is being weaponized by environmental groups, extreme environmental groups?
Well, what I would say and what my experience has been is that the ESA has largely become a mechanism by which environmental groups can use the federal government to impose restrictions on the use of private property and public lands, and also limit our ability to use our energy and water resources, while also receiving massive federal subsidies through sue and settle actions. And what do I mean by that? That it's common knowledge that environmental groups will petition the Fish and Wildlife Service to list a particular species with the understanding that they're either going to do it or refuse to do it, then go ahead and the environmental groups will sue and the agency will settle, list the species, and then under the Equal Access to Justice Act, the environmental groups will receive their attorney's fees paid for by the federal government, which gives them the funds that they need to then go pursue the next action. They can make anywhere from $350 to $800 an hour, plus expenses for bringing these actions. So Earth Justice, the NRDC, Sierra Club, there's a whole variety of environmental groups that their entire business model is based almost exclusively on receiving federal funds to sue the federal government. And so it's a very lucrative business to be in. And in order to make that model work, you got to continuously be fighting to either list additional species or to make sure that the existing species do not come off of that list. So there is a monetary incentive to make sure that we are not delisting the grizzly bear, that we are not delisting the gray wolf. And what my position is, I'm not opposed to the Endangered Species Act. I'm not opposed to the idea that as a society that protecting species and especially species that are endangered or threatened is a moral good and something that we should have a public policy to pursue. But like anything, there has to be a measured response to these things, as well as an appropriate way to approach it. And the way that I always talk about this is we have a finite amount of money, or at least we should, if we'd stop deficit spending and printing money like madmen. But anyway, we have a finite amount of money. And when the Fish and Wildlife Service retains a species on the list when it is no longer endangered or threatened, that is taking resources away from those species that actually are endangered or threatened. I would consider the whooping crane as endangered, the California condor. There are others that are at-risk species that we want to protect. Yet when we can't get the grizzly bear to come off that list, even though we have more than double the number of grizzly bears of the recovery plan, the state of Wyoming and the Fish and Wildlife Service are both spending resources and money on a species that no longer needs that kind of funding. The Canadian gray wolf is another one. It's a classic example. The Canadian gray wolf was introduced into Yellowstone National Park in 1995, and the recovery goal at that time for Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana, and we were considered a DPS, or a distinct population segment, those three states for the Canadian gray wolf. They actually physically brought wolves into Idaho and Wyoming, and they allowed for a natural migration from Canada into Montana. created the Fish and Wildlife Service created under 10J, this DPS, distinct population segment, and each of the states were to have approximately 100 wolves, and there was supposed to be some genetic connectivity and things to protect the longevity of the species and that sort of thing. We met and at that time, the Fish and Wildlife Service had determined that the vast majority of Wyoming was unsuitable for wolf habitat. It was northwestern Wyoming was where the wolves were supposed to be habituated, and that's where they were to remain. And that's largely what's happened in the last almost 30 years. But we met our recovery goals in 2002. Wolves reproduce very, 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 very quickly, very quickly. Within 7 years, we had met in Wyoming our recovery goals, yet the Fish and Wildlife Service refused to delist. Well, I've watched this game play out long enough to know that our side also needs to start suing and start needing to hold the agency accountable. So I filed my first lawsuit against the Fish and Wildlife Service in 2002, demanding that they delist the Canadian gray wolf in Wyoming. We lost that. I anticipated that we would, but I wanted to make sure that we drew that line in the sand, that you Fish and Wildlife Service, you have a recovery goal. We have met the recovery goal. Wyoming has a gray wolf management plan. We have a statutory framework in place. It's time to delist. Over the next several years, we continued filing lawsuits, and then finally in 2010, we were successful, and a federal district court judge in Wyoming ruled that Wyoming's wolf management plan was adequate to protect a recovered wolf population and required the Fish and Wildlife Service to delist. There were a couple of machinations that happened after that. Ultimately, the Fish and Wildlife Service moved forward with delisting, and a bunch of environmental groups sued in the DC District Court back here in Washington, DC. And that DC District Court, she entered an injunction against the Fish and Wildlife Service saying, no, you can't delist. Wyoming's wolf management plan is not adequate. We appealed that to the Circuit Court of Appeals, and in 2017, we received a favorable opinion that Wyoming's wolf management plan was adequate to preserve to protect a recovered wolf population, and that they had to be delisted. Wyoming has been managing our gray wolf population since then. We have over 350 wolves. Our recovery goal was 100. We agreed to 150 to make sure we had a buffer in case there was a disease outbreak or a hard winter or something like that. So our recovery goal is at 150. We have over 350. But there were a couple of things about our plan that I was also adamant about. In Wyoming, the gray wolf is considered predator in the majority of the state, which means we can shoot them on sight. So when they start attacking a sheep band near Casper or livestock near Douglas, we can kill them. There isn't a hunting season there, we can kill them. And we still have been able to maintain more than double a recovered wolf population, even though they're considered predators in most of the state. And I was absolutely unwilling to give up that predator status because I knew how important it was going to be able to manage them. The other thing is we forced the Fish and Wildlife Service to take and the National Park Service to take responsibility for at least 1/3 of the packs that we have to maintain. So Yellowstone National Park has to count at least 5 breeding pairs, which means that doesn't just mean 2 wolves. That means that there's 14, 15 in each associated with each of those breeding pairs. So we have succeeded in managing this population very, very well, highly effectively. That's a success story. Shouldn't have taken 15 years. But it's a success story. We went from having no wolves or limited wolves in Yellowstone National Park to over 350 in northwestern Wyoming, a recovered wolf population, a healthy wolf population, but we're also able to protect our other wildlife and our livestock producers. That's what you need to do to be able to balance, and that's why you want states managing these resources and these species, because they're closer to the issues at hand, are able to respond more quickly and more effectively. But one of the things we've got to do is we've got to get away from this business model that encourages and pays the environmental groups to sue the federal government so that they can get more federal money to pay to sue the federal government. One other thing to keep in mind, a lot of the work that I did on the wolves, I was doing pro bono or for a very much reduced rate. I filed an equal access to justice claim for one aspect of that lawsuit, sought 15 years of litigation, sought $35,000 in attorney's fees and costs total, and it was rejected because the courts will not give. When I win, I don't win Equal Access to Justice Act fees. The courts won't give them. They generally will only give them to the environmental side of the ledger. That's something else that needs to change. So I was not able to get EAJ. My clients were not able to get EAJA funds because the courts have become so liberal that when we prevail against the Fish and Wildlife Service or EPA or whatever the agency is, the fact is that they just simply won't let us have those fees because they don't want us to be to be compensated for what we've had to do.
Oh, that's amazing. Harriet, thanks for all of your hard work in that area. And it truly is heartening to hear a success story. You know, I'm just real quickly reminded of Fish and Wildlife and Parks have just yesterday released their final EIS of bringing grizzly bears into Washington State. I'm not sure if they're your bears to get rid of some of those 1,100. They think we need to spread those around, but they're doing it under a 10J rule. We've got to keep our eyes wide open so that they don't do what they did with the Canadian gray wolf and let them get way out of hand. So
Dan, I'll make one other comment about that. If they're a 10J rule, they're considered probably non-essential experimental. And if they are, keep in mind, there's a completely different way of, not necessarily a different way of managing them, but the entire concept of the 10J rule is if that particular population in Eastern Washington were wiped out tomorrow, by definition, it means that it would not affect the survivability of the species as a whole. So that was something that people didn't understand. It's like, oh, they're threatened. We have to protect them. You can't kill a wolf. And it's like, we could wipe out this entire population tomorrow. It would have no impact on the gray wolf recovery. The other thing to keep in mind very, very quickly is this last week, I went with Pete Stauber, and we had a town hall in northern Minnesota to talk about their gray wolf population and problems. They refer to northern Minnesota as the dead zone because they believe they have well over 6,000 wolves in Minnesota, maybe even double that.
really,
They have just wiped out all other wildlife. And so we've got to go back and we've got to figure out how to fix Minnesota because the enviros keep filing suit every time they try to take them off the list there. And they've got the highest population and they've wiped out all other wildlife. So with that, I'll yield back and let you have a discussion with Rob.
that's amazing. Wow. So Rob, let's get back to you for a second. You're somebody that's worked on ESA issues in both Congress and in a presidential administration. What are some things that you'd like to see in an ESA reform package to make the law serve our species better without causing headaches for the American people? Any thoughts?
You know, the good news there is that the law is so bad that there's endless numbers of fixes to it, right? I'd just like to touch on at the outset a couple of things that both of you have mentioned that I think are really important along those lines. And one is you had raised the question, how many other things are on the list that really shouldn't be there? And I can tell you for the last couple of years, I've been actually kind of looking through that, analyzing several hundred species. And I can tell you that there's, like the recovered species that should never have been listed, there are certainly 100. And I think that's very conservative. Species on the list that the data just don't justify them being there. There are lots of species people would probably be surprised to learn, number in the hundreds of thousands, some in the millions, and have extraordinarily extensive ranges but are still listed. And that's not even getting into the question of like how many of the animals listed on the list are snails or clams or beetles. And you know, you can get into some very long discussions about, well, look, we have say 100 beetles. I don't recollect what the number is. Where do those 100 beetles fit into the literally thousands of beetles that are found in North America? Isn't it going to be natural for some percentage of them to be declining in number while others are increasing? And that gets into a kind of a policy question on where our federal efforts should be focused. And I'll just give you one example. there's a snail that's languished on the list for decades called the Iowa Pleistocene snail. And when it was put on the list, it was believed to only occur at one location, and that the numbers were so few, a single ardent snail collector could wipe out the entire population in a day. Subsequently, it's been found at dozens of locations, and at just one, numbers up to 200,000.
Wow.
But it still fits on the list. And it clearly looks like it's sitting on the list because the Fish and Wildlife Service wants to expand buffer zones around habitat that's already been secured. So it's kind of an endless appetite. And then Rep. Hageman, you mentioned cottage, basically what I consider a cottage industry, which is the lawsuit business around endangered species. And those of us who've worked in it for a long time call a lot of these lawsuits shooting fish in a barrel lawsuits. They're basically related to when the agency doesn't meet some deadline for a species that's been requested to be listed. And my personal impression is a lot of them are not just shooting fish in a barrel timeline lawsuits, but also friendly, in that sometimes the agency is very happy to be forced to have a particular species added to the list that expands its jurisdiction. And nobody really knows how much money is paid out. I tried to look at this back when I was up at the committee, and I know others have years ago tried to get numbers out of the Justice Department, but the way it's historically been recorded is that these figures are really difficult to track down. And I think it's something worth doing. To the big picture on what to do, I'm kind of going to be a Johnny one note, and that is that right now, the law serves as a land use control tool.
Yes, it does.
And the assumption has been that this is essentially the same as a program to conserve endangered species, but it's not. It really needs to be fundamentally altered to be a conservation tool. And as I mentioned, there's so many flaws. I think we need to do 2 or 3 more podcasts to address what we could do to fix it. But fundamentally, we need this change to shift from being land use control and from it being a legal weapon. Private property needs to be protected. Right now, a lot of the burden for a national program to conserve species, which, given that this law has been passed by Congress, is supposed to reflect the will of the people, falls upon a few, those who happen to have the habitat. And if this is something we want to do, then we need to not just place the burden on those who happen to have these species on their property. There also needs to be a greater reliance upon states. And when I say that, it's not that I don't recognize that states are already doing things, but a lot of this occurs in almost kind of a proxy or a deputized manner, where the states are kind of having to carry out things under the ESA framework. We need more rigorous scientific process and to hold administrators accountable. So there's a lot we can do, a lot you can do to fix this.
Well, great, Rob. I appreciate you bringing those points directly home for us on this. Congresswoman Harriet Hageman of Wyoming, Rob Gordon, ESA policy expert, who just published a very interesting report on the Endangered Species Act. I want to thank both of you for sharing your insight and your expertise on this very important issue. Thank you, and thank you to our listeners for tuning in to another episode of the Congressional Western Caucus, a voice for rural America.